Man, it's just been so nice to get out of that house and not have to make YouTube videos for a while. Like, it's peaceful out here. I don't have to deal with the city. There's no radioactive mice in the basement, and I can just enjoy being out here with you guys and talking about some games. And this week, it's all about Hanna-Barbera games on the Super Nintendo. And we're gonna get into those games right after I take a walk in the woods. But while I'm gone, I sure hope no one steals my lunch. My lunch that's in this picnic basket back here. I mean, it would really suck if a certain cartoon bear came out of nowhere and stole my picnic basket. Oh, God! What was that? Obviously, you guys know Hanna-Barbera, the Flintstones, Jetsons, Scoob, all that stuff. And if you're around my age, then I'm pretty sure most of you probably remember a lot of this stuff from back when Cartoon Network first hit airwaves. Back when the channel was basically just non-stop old Hanna-Barbera shows before they finally started making new stuff.
Wise Papa Smith.
But what I actually remember Hanna-Barbera from was the USA Cartoon Express, the block of cartoons that almost no kid wanted to be seeing since it was on the USA Network every Sunday morning at like 7 a.m. So you had to get up really early to see these cartoons on a Sunday. But since I was already up every Sunday morning to go to church with my grandparents, this was literally the only cartoons on TV at the time that I could watch. And as far as I could tell, it was pretty much all Hanna-Barbera stuff. And it wasn't even the popular Hanna-Barbera stuff. It was like the cast-offs from the 70s and 80s. Stuff like Turbo Teen, where some kid turns into a car to fight crime. Space Ghost was here as well, but not the cool Cartoon Network Space Ghost that everyone would know and love. This was back when he was just a generic superhero fighting bad guys in space with 2 teenage sidekicks and a monkey. And there was other stuff that no one remembers these days, like the Paw Paw Bears. Do you guys remember the Paw Paw Bears at all? Because I know you don't. Nobody remembers the Paw Paw Bears. So that was essentially my experience with Hanna-Barbera. And even when I did see the more popular stuff like the Flintstones, I wasn't really as into it as other kids were, except Scooby, because everybody loves Scoob in the game. But my long drawn-out point here is that my general malaise for Hanna-Barbera carried over into video games as well, once those shows started getting a bunch of games tossed out for them. I actually totally skipped the NES stuff and only really got into them once I started playing on the Super Nintendo. Probably because there was nothing better at the video store at the time, and I just ended up picking this one up. The Flintstones in the Treasure of Sierra Madrock. And I think this is probably the game that most people are familiar with. If you played a Hanna-Barbera game on the Super Nintendo, this was probably it. Not due to it just being the Flintstones either, because it's actually a really good game and got solid reviews in magazines back then. And right off the bat, this one's actually doing some really neat stuff. Instead of just simply moving through worlds and selecting levels like you do in most of these kind of platformers, this actually blends platforming with something more like a board game. You take turns controlling Fred and Barney as they roll the dice to see where they go next on the map. And since this is set up like a board game, there's stuff all over the place besides just stages. Stuff like shops to buy things in, little bonus games that you can play, and even a coliseum where you can train to get new moves like double jumps. Wilma and Betty are also just kind of roaming around the map to drag you back a spot or two if they catch you, so just exploring the map is a lot of fun on its own. And there's actually multiple paths that you can take around these levels so that you're just not following behind the other character all the time. But thankfully, the actual stages are fun too. Barney and Fred play pretty much the same, and neither really have that much at their disposal besides a floating jump and a club attack. And since this is going for that more board game thing, the levels themselves are actually really short, none of them lasting for more than just a couple of minutes so that the other player doesn't get bored waiting their turn. The problem is that most of these stages on the map are just variations of the same few obstacles used over and over again. And after a few of these, you just kind of get the feeling that you've played them before. Even the bosses of each level repeat themselves multiple times on the map. Thankfully, like I said, the game moves along at a fast enough pace while you're playing that it really doesn't make it that big of a deal. The point of each map is to keep moving Barney and Fred around until you find one of your fellow water buffaloes standing around. Catch up to them and they challenge you to a very awkward Mode 7 race in the Coliseum. win the race, and the path to the new area opens up somewhere, making you just kind of wander around to find it by rolling the dice over and over again. And that's probably the game's one big issue. The dice-based system can kind of make progress feel slow at times, especially if you're just playing by yourself, since you're still forced to play each character's turn. The random rolls and occasional setbacks can just kind of drag things out longer than necessary. Still though, that really doesn't take away from how surprisingly fun and well-made this game actually is. It's one of those games where you boot it up and you just instantly get that feeling of playing something with your little brother on a Saturday morning back in the early 90s. This is definitely a great Super Nintendo game if you haven't played it, especially if you got someone else around to play with you. But it wasn't just Fred on the Super Nintendo, because we're actually just getting started here. And next up is actually the Jetsons' Invasion of the Planet Pirates. And if you haven't noticed yet, Taito, the developer of both of these, was making a lot of games based on Hanna-Barbera cartoons. But what's surprising is just how good most of them actually were. They could have done what a lot of developers did, which was just make cheap, quick games to sell off the name. But Taito didn't. We just saw how good the Flintstones was, and the Jetsons actually continues that trend. This one's all about a group of space thieves called Spree that travel from planet to planet stealing resources. Their leader, Zora, sets his sights on Earth, so Captain Zoom turns to George Jetson for whatever reason for help. He gives George a little gadget called the POP, short for Pneumo-Osmotic Precipitator, basically just a futuristic vacuum cleaner that does a whole bunch of stuff. What it means for you as the player, though, is that you're going to be using this thing a lot to get around stages. And that's actually going to probably take a second to get used to, since this thing can actually do a surprising amount of stuff. You can vacuum up enemies, boxes, and items, and then just shoot them back out as weapons, which honestly just kind of reminds me of picking up and tossing stuff in Rescue Rangers on the NES, though it's much more expanded here. But the POP isn't just for fighting, it's actually a big part of just getting around the levels as well. And this is where things can kind of be hit or miss. By jumping and pressing Y in midair, George can actually latch onto walls or ceilings, and until you get used to the intricacy of POP traversal, you're probably going to have more than a few frustrating moments, especially when the game wants you to suck your way across the ceiling. You can also use it to climb around obstacles or just grab items that are just out of reach. Almost every stage uses this vacuum cleaner in a new way, for basic platforming, climbing walls while they close in on you, all sorts of stuff. Like I said, it's not perfect, some sections can be pretty awkward, but it's actually creative, and the game encourages you to experiment with it since there's just a ton of places that you can explore. But even with a little bit of frustration, Invasion of Planet Pirates is still a really fun game. The graphics look just like the show, the music's surprisingly decent, and the POP mechanic keeps things interesting throughout the game. And you might be thinking that this is just a reskin of a Japanese game or something, but it's actually the other way around. The Jetsons was actually made for the US market first, and then later reworked in Japan as Yokai Buster. In that version, you play as a cute anime girl carrying around this monster head thing that acts exactly like the POP. Both versions play pretty much the same, but it's still worth checking out the Japanese version just because of all of these weird changes, especially since the Western version came out first, which just was not very common back then. But overall, Taito really deserves a lot of credit for how they handled these Hanna-Barbera games, and as we're about to see, things started to go downhill as soon as Taito wasn't making these things anymore. And the first one of those on the Super Nintendo was Scooby Doo Mystery, which is an oddly plain title compared to these other ones, but let's see if a different developer could do Scoob and the Gang a little bit of justice. And I'll say this about it, it's at least different, because as soon as you jump out of the Mystery Machine, you get something you probably weren't expecting. You control Shaggy, with Scooby following along as your terrified mystery-solving partner. Fred, Velma, and Daphne are also assisting in smaller ways throughout each level. But getting through those levels requires a little bit more detective work than what you might be thinking, since this is actually closer to an adventure game than anything else. Each level starts out just like the show, with the Mystery Machine on the road to the next god-awful place that the gangs decided to go visit. and after that, the game switches to a side-scrolling exploration setup. Each level is made up of multiple connected rooms that you have to move through from left to right, and you can also enter doors in the background or foreground by pressing up or down. The rest of the gang hangs around too, with Fred giving you hints on what to do next, Velma studying the stuff that you find, and Daphne doing her thing of just looking smoking hot while handing out Scooby snacks occasionally. But what are you actually doing in these levels? Well, you're finding clues to solve the mystery. And most of the clues are pretty easy to find, often just kind of placed out in plain sight, many just appearing a few steps away from where you need to use them. You can actually just collect several at once and then bring them all back to Velma, which usually moves the investigation into a new area. There are some hidden clues around that you have to find by using Scoob's nose and holding the Y button, but you need to be standing in the exact right spot to find these things. So later stages can actually turn into you slowly walking through every inch of a level just to make sure that you didn't miss something with Scoob's nose. It's not all just about finding clues though, since there's actually a few enemies roaming around as well, though most of them are just small animals that move back and forth. Touching them fills up Shaggy's scare meter, and when it's full, you lose a life. Enemies don't really attack or make noise or anything, so half the time they just surprise you and suddenly half your scare meter's filled up. Thankfully, Daphne's usually hanging around to give you a few Scooby snacks to help you calm down. The main level monsters also show up too, but they're not your typical enemies. They usually just appear without any warning and drain your scare meter really fast, and you usually need to use a specific item to deal with them, like tossing out a trolley and making them crash into the door. And while all of this does sound like a decent Scooby game, the actual result is kinda clunky. It's not really sure if it wants to be an adventure game or a platformer. Like I said, enemies aren't aggressive at all, but you still have to collect items to throw at them, like rolling carts and fish, but aiming all of this stuff sucks. So it's usually easier just to jump over them, except jumping is even worse, and that's because it's super delayed. Platforming sections though are just the worst part of the whole game, because suddenly the game wants you to be precise with that terrible jump, and landing too close to an edge makes you fall through the platform, because of course it does. So one of the biggest mysteries of this whole game is why these sections even made it in. But if you got patience, the game does take you through 4 episodes from the show. You get the ghost ship, the fun fair, the spooky swamp, and of course the haunted Bradshaw Manor. But nothing really changes besides those settings. All you're doing is just searching around for obvious clues, bringing them to Velma, and then opening up new areas until the case is solved. And honestly, after doing all that in the first level, the novelty starts to fade pretty quick. But at least they didn't just turn Shaggy and Scooby into some annoying platform game. Instead, they just turned it into an annoying adventure game. And I mean, honestly, I can kind of appreciate that. I mean, it's got a fun setup, it looks just like the show, and it does seem to enjoy being a Scooby game. And I think that alone is worth a Scooby snack or two.
Here comes Yogi!
Especially when we got Yogi here to drag us down to the absolute bottom of the barrel of Hanna-Barbera Super Nintendo games. Because out of all of these games, this is the only one that doesn't even seem to care that it's actually a Hanna-Barbera game. At least the others, even Scooby, treated the games like they were just fun episodes from the show. Yogi though, this one ain't it. You of course play as Yogi Bear, walking mostly to the right through Jellystone Park. Each stage has you collecting picnic baskets and stopwatches, but you can kinda just ignore all of that since none of it actually matters. This is as basic of a platform game as you're gonna find on the system. So if you're not excited about playing a game with Yogi Bear in it, then there's not much else here that's gonna impress you. The stuff that Yogi can do is extremely limited. He can run, duck, and hop on enemies like you'd expect to do. You can also butt bounce on picnic baskets to reach higher areas, but since there's almost no reason to explore, it's mostly pointless. Yogi at least moves fast, but he's kinda too fast, so the only real challenge is not slamming into enemies because you can't stop in time. And the enemies themselves are just all super basic as well, because once you figure out how to jump on these rabbits in the very first stage, you'll know exactly how to deal with them in the second stage, and the third stage, and the fourth. They're in the entire damn game. As mentioned, there's no reason to explore for power-ups or anything like that, so you're literally just trying to get to the end of each stage, and that kinda gets boring. The stages do at least have a little bit of variety, but once you play the first stage, you pretty much know what the entire game's gonna be besides a couple of little things here and there. But the biggest issue that I have with this whole game is that it doesn't even feel like a Yogi Bear game. Aside from picnic baskets and Yogi himself, there's almost nothing tying this to the brand. The whole thing just feels super generic, like a ROM hack of a different game where someone just slapped a Yogi sprite on top of it. If there's one good thing that I can actually say about it, I guess it doesn't look half bad. Yogi looks like Yogi, he's not unpleasant to look at, but nothing really goes above average here. It's one of those games that's not really broken or offensive, it just kind of exists. And that sucks because I can think of like a half a dozen ways to make a better Yogi game than this. And I'm not even that big of a Yogi fan. So yeah, this is definitely one picnic basket that's not worth rating. Overall though, Hanna-Barbera games on the Super Nintendo ain't half bad. The two title games alone are better than most licensed games could have ever dreamed of being. Even the Scooby game is kinda neat. Only Yogi really kinda lets the bunch down, and that's mostly because it doesn't really try to live up to the rest of them. Now, before everyone starts yelling at me, I do know that this isn't a complete list of Hanna-Barbera games on the Super Nintendo. Actually, I've already covered both Pirates of Darkwater and SWAT Kats in other videos, both Hanna-Barbera games. But I kinda just wanted to cover the games that I think everyone associates with classic Hanna-Barbera in this video. There is a Tom and Jerry game on the Super Nintendo though, but I've never really been too sure of where to put Tom and Jerry underneath that whole brand. Yes, Hanna and Joseph Barbera did create Tom and Jerry, but it was for MGM Studios, and actually had several people responsible for it over the years until the 70s when Hanna-Barbera took it back over with the Tom and Jerry show. As for the game though, well, if you gotta know, it's not too great. So far from what I've played, it just seems like another basic platformer where you play as Jerry, making your way through a bunch of different stages. It does seem like it's at least better than Yogi, but that's not exactly high praise. Maybe I'll cover this one a little bit more in depth in a future Saturday morning cartoon video, but as it stands, I'm not too impressed with what little I played. But there actually is one more Hanna-Barbera game on the system that I wanted to mention, and that's Hanna-Barbera Turbo Toons, a European-only racing game apparently made by like 2 people. It's basically a very simple overhead racer. If you've ever played something like Super Off-Road, it's kinda like that, just not very good. The tracks only occupy one screen, and your character's physics are just so wonky that it's hard to just run in a straight line at times. Honestly, it doesn't even really seem like it's a full game sometimes, so I don't want to talk too much mess about a game that had a very limited release and was only made by a couple of guys in a few months. Still, let me know if you've played this one, because it's at least an interesting footnote in Hanna-Barbera games on the Super Nintendo. But guys, I think that's all of them. I might be wrong, and if you know something I don't, then let me know in the comments below. But like I said, Hanna-Barbera was actually represented pretty well on the Super Nintendo. Even that Yogi game isn't gonna make you hate life or anything, and the title games are genuinely really good. If you've never played those, then I definitely suggest starting with those and checking them out. And if you have already, then let me know in the comments below what you think. And also feel free to sub to the channel if you want to see some more of these kinds of weird licensed games in the future, because that's kind of what we do around here. But as for me, I think I'm done with this whole relaxing in the forest thing. I think I'd have better luck back at my place with the radioactive rats. But anyway, thanks for watching this video, and I'll be back next week with hopefully another one of these. But until then, keep those picnic baskets safe.